Right. Oh, it's wonderful to see people. Hello. My name is Jasmine Gonzalez Rose, and I am a professor here at BU School of Law. And it is my absolute privilege this afternoon to introduce our speaker today, who is Laura Gomez from UCLA School of Law, where she is a professor of law and holds the Rachel F. Moran Endowed Chair in Law. And she also has appointments in sociology and Chicana Studies. And she started the renowned Critical Race Studies program at UCLA. She has a BA from Harvard, an MA, a JD, a PhD from Stanford University, and she clerked for Dorothy W. Nelson on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. She is a prolific scholar, numerous articles, book chapters, and some very amazing books, including Manifest Destinies, The Making of the Mexican American Race. And of course, today we're incredibly excited to have her speaking on Inventing Latinos, a new story of American racism. She is an absolute leader. In addition to being a founder, she's been a director of the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA, a former vice dean at the law school, president of the Law and Society Association as well. And she's really also taken time to be an amazing mentor. And I remember about 12 years ago when I was first on the market for law teaching, how she made time to mentor me, and how she really taught me to ask for what I need and some lessons that I continue to pass on to others. So I'm incredibly indebted to her, both as a scholar and also as a mentor. These are lessons we can carry with us for our entire careers. You've really touched so many people. We're absolutely honored to have you here, very excited. I see many of my students from Latinx's in the Law who've had, even though your book just came out in August, it's already been studied in this course, and I know others. So welcome. We can't wait to hear from you.
Thank you, Professor Gonzalez-Rose. My name is Jonathan Feingold. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm an associate professor here at BU. And I'm also so thrilled that we have Professor Gomez here with us today. I'm going to give us some just admin to start off, and then a very quick intro, and then I'm going to pass it back over to Professor Gomez. Just one note, we are recording this talk, and so I'm just a heads up to everyone on that front. So everyone has a sense of format. After I stop speaking in a couple moments, Professor Gomez will present her project for about 20 minutes or so. Then Professor Gonzalez-Rose and I will get the Q&A going by each asking a question. And at that point, we're just going to turn it over to Q&A. I do see that quite a few of our students are here. This is a notice for them that I expect one or two questions, if not more, from our students. I know that you've all been engrossed with Professor Gomez's work, both in my class and in Professor Gonzalez-Rose's class. And I know she looks forward to hearing from you. I will keep a queue. And so after or once we enter the Q&A, if you do have a question, I just ask that you show me that little blue Zoom hand, and then we'll take it from there. And I think the only thing that I will add at this point is that I really do want to emphasize how much Professor Gomez has been an institution builder. Professor Gonzalez-Rose spoke to that a little bit, but I think what you often miss in the CV and all the roles held and all the titles is just the human capital building that Professor Gomez is responsible for. And just a very just short personal anecdote. When I was entering the job market, I had an unexpected interview at an unexpected time, and Professor Gomez was on the phone with me on a Saturday afternoon, helping me prep for an interview that I was woefully unprepared for before that phone call. And I really do think it's those little things that, for me, make it so special that we get to be in conversation with Professor Gomez today. But of course, I think so many of us are here because of the moment we're in which race has become so salient, in which so many of us are trying to better understand the way in which Latino identity operates in the United States. And we really could not ask for a more more insightful experience person to guide us through this conversation. And so with that, welcome, Professor Gomez. We're so excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much. And thank you both, Professor Gonzalez Rose and Professor Feingold, for those very generous introductions. And it was actually both Jonathan and Jasmine who reached out to me to invite me. And having those connections with both of you led me to immediately say yes. And I really appreciate your both kind of signaling the role that I've played in mentoring, because I think that's one of the most important things that I can do as a faculty member in my now 27th year of law teaching. So I really, those are among some of the most rewarding parts of my job that I don't get to really you know, we don't make a big deal out of it, but it means a lot. So it's really nice to hear that. And I also just want to say, I don't think she's here, but I want to just give a shout out to my dear friend and someone I just respect tremendously, who is Dean Angela Anuwachi Willig, who is just incredible. So you guys have a great team here at BU Law, and it's really my pleasure to be with you today, even though we're not doing it in person, as we all wish that we could be. So when one is speaking about a book, one always faces this dilemma of how to cover such a large topic. And what most authors do is focus on one chapter. And with that in mind, I circulated chapter 3 to you. But I'm going to try to have my cake and eat it too today, which is spend the next 20 minutes trying to give you this overview and talk a little bit about each chapter, and hope that this whirlwind tour you know, sort of gives you a taste of things, and then we can go deeper into the chapter that you read, some of you read, or we can talk about current events or anything else that you might want to talk about. So chapter 1 is entitled, "We Are Here Because You Were There." And I survey the long history of US empire in North and South America in this chapter. Due to American imperialism, Latino immigrants, especially those from Central America, Mexico, and the Spanish Caribbean, should be considered involuntary migrants and treated accordingly under the law. Let's focus on Central Americans to illustrate my point. They are 9% of all Latinos in the US. The intensity and cumulative nature of US imperialism in Central America is staggering. First of all, consider how long it has been going on for. It started in 1916 when the Marines occupied Nicaragua for 20 years. It went on into the 30s when the US installed Anastasio Somoza as dictator of Nicaragua, allowing him and his sons to control that country for 4 decades. And as late as 1990, Ronald Reagan ordered 20,000 troops to Nicaragua, along with a covert operation to support the anti-Sandinista Contras. A chief strategy in Central America for the US has been to train militaries and national police forces who often turn their weapons on their citizens. More than 60,000 Latin American military officers have been trained by the American military at the School of the Americas for over more than 6 decades, from 1940 to 2000 when the school closed. Sticking with the example of Nicaragua, his regime slaughtered 50,000 people in the 1970s out of a population of 3.5 million. To imagine the scope, that would be equivalent to 5 million casualties in the US today. We are struggling under the burden of having lost 240,000 Americans, but imagine 5 million. In the 1980s, the US funded Contras killed another 30,000 people in Nicaragua. In El Salvador, there was no intervention by the US until 1961. And at that time, it was American fear that communism would spread from Cuba to Central America that led the US to support a right-wing candidate. And in fact, it was that right-wing administration in the 30s that fueled an opposition movement that came to fruition in the 1980s. And it was that civil war that, of course, led to intervention by the US in the form of $6 billion in military aid. And during the 80s, the military and police in El Salvador increased from 15,000 troops to 52,000 troops in 3 years, thanks to this military aid by the US. And these death squads in El Salvador murdered 75,000, mostly indigenous Salvadorans in the 1980s. In Guatemala, American imperialism was slightly different, right? So we've seen the Nicaraguan example of sort of outright military force, the Salvadorian example of behind the scenes political and military support. And now in Guatemala, it was a corporate colonialism that was led by one of the largest American corporations of the time, United Fruit Company. A company that was so closely linked to the US that its general counsel and board members often moved back and forth between the corporation and cabinet positions. United Fruit entered Guatemala in 1899, and twice UFC enlisted the US Navy to intervene to stop the government there from regulating the corporation. And in the 1940s, we tried to exercise a coup after a left-wing leader was elected. And during this period of a 35-year civil war in Guatemala, 200,000 civilians were murdered, and more than 80% of them were Maya people. This is nothing less than an indigenous genocide that would not have occurred without the US support of the government. So the point of chapter 1 is that we have to understand colonialism as on the same continuum as immigration. We have immigration in the United States historically and today because the US was meddling in Latin America. And our immigration law and policy should reflect that reality. Chapter 2 is called Idealized Mestizaje, and anti-Black and anti-Indian racism among Latinos. And my focus in my brief summary of chapter 2 is going to be on Latinos from the Spanish Caribbean, who combined together make up 17% of the Latino population. Puerto Ricans are 10% of the population, Cubans are 4%, and Dominicans are 3%. Looking at the Spanish Caribbean puts in sharp relief the legacy of an even earlier colonialism of the Americas. And of course, I'm referring to the Spanish colonial period. After Spanish contact, at Spanish contact rather, there were 80 million indigenous people in Latin America, but only 10 million of them survived Spanish contact, genocide, and enslavement. the Spanish brought at least 12 million African slaves to the Americas. And the result of this, the result of their system of white supremacy, which did not enforce bans on marriage or sexual contact among racial groups, was mestizaje, or racial mixture. We see the results of that racial mixture in the families of our faces today. But I don't want to romanticize that mestizaje. Along with mestizaje came colorism, a preference for lighter skin, and racism, and specifically anti-Black and anti-Indian racism among Latinos. And today in the United States, we see in effect four distinct layers of white supremacy that operate to shape Latinos as a racial group. We see, number one, the effects of Spanish colonialism. Number two, the effects of Latin American countries post-independence from Spain, policies such as those that sought to bring white Europeans to their countries. We see those results in the US today. But then we see the American-style white supremacy that was exported to Latin America in the form of the imperialism that I was talking about before in chapter 1. And finally, we see white supremacy in the United States, both in terms of how it's propagated in American cultural production in terms of film and television and sent across the world, including Latin America, but also in terms of how the racial hierarchy in the US today affects Latinos. One upshot of all of these four different layers of white supremacy is that Caribbean Latinos in the United States often underestimate their African ancestry to a degree that is confusing for others in the US who see them as Black. Consider that since the 2000 census, we have been able to self-identify with 2 or more races on the census. So we could say that we're, white, Black, Indigenous, right? If we wanted to, we could say that we have all of those strands. But what we find is that Latinos underemphasize their Indigenous and their African ancestry. For example, while Dominican Latinos are more likely than any other group to identify as African American or Black on the census, it's still only 8% of Dominicans who say they're Black, and 6% of Puerto Ricans in the US on the mainland who say that they're Black, which is actually a higher number than the number of Puerto Ricans on the island who say that they're Black on the census. Instead, what we see among Puerto Ricans and Dominican Latinos is that large numbers of them choose to identify as other race on the census, right? So they reject white, Black, American Indian, Asian American, and they're choosing other. And one of the things that's interesting, particularly given the dynamics of the past week, is that this tendency to identify as other versus white on the census varies by region. So for example, Dominicans in Florida are twice as likely as Dominicans in New York and New Jersey to choose white as their racial identity. Now, is there a difference in the racial, makeup of those Dominicans in the Northeast compared to Florida? Probably not. But there's a different kind of signaling. And my hypothesis is that selecting white on the census for Latinos is about that anti-Black racism in our community, but also about the recognition that Dominicans in Florida, Dominicans in the former Confederacy, face a stronger degree of racism than those in the Northeast. Turning to chapter 3, which I circulated, the elusive quest of whiteness, here I want to just focus on Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans are nearly 7 out of 10 of all Latinos. And so that's often, because that's such an overwhelming number, we have to really understand Mexican Americans whenever we're talking about Latinos, right? So 8 out of 10 Mexican Americans are US citizens, which is much higher than all of the Latino subgroups, except for Cuban Americans. And of course, Puerto Ricans. Why? Because Cuban Americans came to this country as refugees, eligible for naturalization after a year of being here, and because Puerto Ricans are not immigrants at all as residents of a U.S. territory. The dynamic that I want to briefly discuss here, and of course, all of this, I know I'm kind of whipping through things quickly. We can go back and talk about any of these in greater detail in the question and answer period, and I would welcome that. So I just want to highlight the dynamic that Mexican Americans in particular have served as a buffer group between whites above them and African Americans below them. And part of that has involved Mexican Americans having access to a certain kind of whiteness. And it started with 1848 and the end of the US war with Mexico. In order to gain Mexico's surrender and for Mexico, in order to gain back their country and end the occupation by the Americans, Mexico ceded half of its territory to the US, right? Where I am right now in California, where I grew up, New Mexico, all of the vast West. Imagine the country without that land. And in that region lived 115,000 Mexican citizens. And I'm not including in that number those indigenous persons who had really resisted the Mexican occupation of the region as well, right? I'm talking about those who were had basically Mexican citizens. And under this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, those 115,000 Mexican Americans gained American citizenship. And that happened at a time when only whites could naturalize under the 1790 Naturalization Act, which wasn't changed until after the Civil War to include naturalization eligibility for those of African ancestry as well. Now going forward, I want to just briefly mention that even as Mexican immigrants came into the US, they continued to benefit from this 1848 treaty. One example is a naturalization case called In re Rodriguez from San Antonio, Texas in 1907, in which the judge says, yeah, I'm looking at Mr. Rodriguez and I see that he's not white. He looks like an Indian to me. And the anthropologist expert witness came in and said that he looked like an Indian. But I'm going to say that he's white and eligible for naturalization because the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had this collective naturalization, right? Now, what was going on, though, was that there was a particular struggle happening in San Antonio at the time vis-a-vis the political economy of immigration. On the one side, there were whites in San Antonio who said there are too many Mexicans and they're voting too much. This was 1907, even though it sounds familiar. And on the other side, agribusiness employers who said, we need Mexican laborers. You cannot stop Mexican immigration. And that kind of back and forth about Mexican immigration and Mexican labor characterized actually all of the 20th century, and into the 21st century is still very much what we see. Okay, so I'm gonna just rush through. Jonathan, are you keeping time for me? How am I doing with our goals?
So you're fine. I mean, I do want to defer to you 5 minutes, 7 minutes, if that's good for you. I think feel
Okay,
free to take
sounds
it.
good. Perfect, perfect. So let me say one more thing about this idea that Mexican Americans are this buffer, right, between whites above them and blacks below them, and how that operated. It led Mexican Americans at times, in particular in the early and the mid 20th century, to assert whiteness, and at the same time to be trying to fight discrimination. But they didn't want, they were very careful trying to situate themselves as distinct from African Americans, right? So, kind of, we're not Black, but we're being discriminated against. And that was really a bind. And I wrote about this in the context of Hernandez versus Texas, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A. But by the 60s and 70s, that has broken down, and we see a rise of the idea that Mexican Americans are not white. And this is happening for Puerto Ricans at the same time as well. Chapter 4, to count, we must be counted, is a kind of a exploration of the census. And I talk about the US Census as a central dynamic that is about making race because census categories change over time, right? We don't have the same census categories that we had in 1970 today. This concept of self-identity, racial self-identity, that's a concept that only started in 1970. Before that, we had census enumerators, and census enumerators would not ask somebody when they'd go to somebody's house to count them for the census. They wouldn't say, what is your race? They would just look at them and they would fill in their racial categories, right? So all of these various dynamics about the census in history are discussed in this 4th chapter. Let me just talk briefly about the fight to count Latinos under the census. So prior to 1980, there was no specific categorical or classificatory counting of Latinos. And after the 1970, and the story of how that happened goes back to the 1970 census, in which a new organization at the time, MALDEF, for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, sued the federal government, saying that Mexican Americans were undercounted because they were using proxies like, do you speak Spanish at home, or Spanish surname, which were under inclusive of Mexican Americans. They actually lost the lawsuit, but what the lawsuit did at summary judgment, is it sensitized politicians and state leaders and Latino civil rights organizations to activate pressure. And by 1980, the census did an about face and included what is called the Hispanic ethnicity question. Now, all of you are probably familiar with this because you would have filled out the census, hopefully, this year. And you saw that there are two questions related to race in the United States. One question is are you Hispanic or Latino? Yes or no? And then there's another question as to race. Well, how did this come to be? Why are these two questions? And why are Asian Americans, for example, who were also added to the race question in 1980, why are they in the race question, but not in a separate question, are you Asian American, right? The theory, or at least what the census tells us officially, is, well, Mexican Americans can be of any race, right? Per the Spanish colonialism, the importation of African slaves and the indigenous peoples who were the original peoples of Latin America, there's a certain truth in that, right? But it obscures another truth. And that other truth is that our census categories don't exist in some, they don't reflect, quote unquote, real biological differences, right? They reflect socially constructed race. And the idea that, that African Americans are less diverse than Latinos simply is not correct, right? We know that there's diversity in all racial groups, all these categories that we use. So what I am advocating for in this chapter is that Latinos be counted in racial terms, and the fact that about 40% of Latinos will, in the 2020 census, when we get the results, have chosen to say that they were other, in other words, have rejected white and Black and American Indian and Asian American. That will make the second largest racial group in the US, according to the census, other in 2020. And it's because of Latinos. Now, the Census Bureau statisticians themselves realized this and wanted to add other into, wanted to add, fold Latinos, take away the Hispanic ethnicity question and fold it into the race question. And the Trump administration blocked that as part of a more general census story, which you're familiar with and which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A if you'd like. I just want to end very quickly by talking a little bit about the census and political power, right? So once we could count Latinos, right, then we could say, oh, Latinos are 20% of the American population as they are today, but they're only 11% of the national electorate. And that's mostly not because Latinos aren't citizens, right? Because only 1/6 of Latinos are ineligible to vote because they're immigrants, and about half of those because they're undocumented immigrants. It's mostly about age. Latinos are an incredibly young population, and 1/3 of all Latinos are under the age 18. And with each election, we're going to see the impact of those Latinos turning 18 and becoming energized. For example, between 2016 and the 2018 midterms, 4 million additional Latinos voted, the vast majority of them because they turned 18. And we're going to see similar results when we finally get all the results from 2020. And I guess I'll just close by talking about the story of Arizona a little bit, and then we can explore other questions in the Q&A. Arizona is, of course, the birthplace of modern conservatism, right? It's Barry Goldwater country, and it was John McCain country. John McCain may have been a moderate, but he was a fierce Republican as well. And yet today, Biden is on track to win Arizona, to turn Arizona blue. What has happened? Well, Latinos are 25% of eligible voters in Arizona. A progressive Latino organization called Lucha has registered 600,000 Latinos since 2016. Lucha has led a minimum wage increase that was decided and passed in 2018. In 2016, they were key to defeating Joe Arpaio as sheriff, whom Trump pardoned right after he was inaugurated, by the way. It was Arpaio who was aggressively enforcing SB 1070, the Show Me Your Papers law, between 2010 and 2016 when he was voted out. And in 2018, it was Latinos who put Kristen Sinema over the line for the Senate, and who in this election put Mark Kelly over the line for the Senate. So I think that, you know, when we look at the results of last week's election, we will see that in addition to 60% of Arizonans voting to legalize marijuana and 52% of Arizonans voting to raise taxes on those with incomes above 250,000, I think we're going to see a Biden-Harris win as well. And on that very contemporary note, I'm going to stop and turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. Jasmine, would you like to kick it off with the first question?
Sure, absolutely. So we left on a contemporary note, and I want to kind of bring that what you were talking about in the beginning to what you were talking about at the end. And so I'm really interested in how you break down involuntary migration and give us the story of US intervention, expansionism, colonialism, military activity, and these capitalistic endeavors, which all prompted migration. So this really goes against the typical narrative of Latino immigration. And I'd love to hear more from you about how does this change the narrative? How should this change policy? And particularly your argument that of immigration reform as a form of reparations for US wrongdoing in Latin America. I'd love to hear more.
Thank you so much for that question, Professor Gonzalez-Rose. I guess I will start with the idea that we might think about reparations in multiple ways, right? So when we think about reparations in the present moment, since the tragic murder of Mr. George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, that has allowed us to begin in earnest a national conversation about reparations to African Americans for slavery. And that's an incredible, it's an incredible turn of events that we're talking about that seriously, and it's long overdue, right? That view of reparations envisions that African Americans who are descendants of slaves can would receive some kind of monetary compensation. But reparations doesn't have to be in the form of dollars. I go back to the root of the word reparations and repair. So what would it mean to repair this really horrible legacy of the United States in terms of imperialism in Latin America? And what I would suggest is that to repair that, we take a very different approach to immigration from Central America, Mexico, and the Spanish Caribbean, which happen to be the regions of Latin America where there was the most intensive US US imperialism, US military intervention, and where there is in some of those places still today, right? For example, the Southern Command is headquartered in Puerto Rico today, right? We still have a military base in Cuba, right? Sorry. So what would it mean to take seriously the fact that the migrants from these places they should be welcome to the US, because we created the dynamics in most cases. For example, when we went into these countries, and I could give you examples from all over the place, you heard a few of them from Central America, but there are many others. We went into these countries and we produced economic dislocation that led to migrations from rural areas to cities, and then unemployment, and then migration to the US. And that migration has been desired by the US because it's meant that there has always been this large workforce of very vulnerable, because they aren't citizens or because they're guest workers, workers who don't have bargaining rights, who are available for this low wage work. And of course, today with COVID, we're seeing that those are the workers who are most vulnerable right now. They're people who don't have any hope of working from home, right? They're people who don't have the luxury of being able to say, I'm exposed too much at work, so I'm not going to go into work, right? We have depended on this vulnerable labor force to do our dirty work for 150 years, basically. And my argument is that those undocumented persons living in the United States should receive citizenship. That should be a generous pathway to citizenship, in that it should be, the scope should be broad in terms of the 11 million people who are living in the United States without legal authorization. That another prong of that reparations would include that all future Central American migration would be would follow under collective refugee status. You know, why is that we treated Cubans who were fleeing the Castro regime as refugees, but not Central Americans fleeing these regimes? And you know, not only are we not doing that, we're not even at the present moment under the Trump administration, we're not even complying with the international laws that shape how refugees should be processed, right? Such as by allowing them to come into our country and wait for their asylum claims to be processed. We're not complying with that anymore. So that's some of the things that I think, and I don't know, Jasmine, did I answer all the different parts of your question?
You did, thank you.
Okay.
So I'm going to forego my question, and because I know there's a lot of folks here, and so I would invite anyone who wants to ask a question to put your blue hand up. I am going to try to prioritize students, though, to be fair, I don't know many of our students, and so if I miss you, my apologies. Professor Sherman Stokes, though, did have her hand up, so I'm going to start there, and then I'm going to go to Monica Gutierrez, Professor Sipe, and Professor Volk.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Laura. This is just a phenomenal project, and I just ordered the book from Bookshop while you were speaking, so I look forward to reading it. I'm I'm really excited to read it because I wrote a paper called Reparations for Central American Refugees, and really takes at its core this this obligation that we have to repair, thinking about sort of the duty and tort, right? Like we're the, we've created the harm. We have an obligation to repair. And I was wondering if you could talk, just building on Jasmine's excellent question, not only, I guess I find myself overwhelmed by the enormity of the harm and the many ways in which we've caused it. So it's not, it's the economic harm, and it's, funding paramilitary operations, but it's also the harm of deportation and exporting gang membership, and then subsequently training, as you mentioned, training law enforcement. So I was wondering if you could just speak maybe even a little bit more specifically, if you, were advising a new administration, for example, just, hypothetically speaking, what might you suggest a comprehensive reform package for Central Americans in particular would look like? We had the American Baptist Churches settlement in the past, we had the creation of TPS, so there has been some repair, but it has been totally inadequate. And so I would love to hear maybe some specifics on the, as we are about to enter a new administration.
Yeah, well, I thank you for that question. Thank you for your own work in this area. I am not a scholar or teacher of immigration law, so I don't think I have the kind of concrete things you're looking for, but what I would say is that in particular, just referencing the two examples that you just mentioned, the ABC case and the TPS, temporary protective status, those are precisely the kind of things that we should not be doing, because they were so piecemeal. And temporary protective status, and I blame the Democrats as much as Republicans for this, is that TPS is this idea that, oh, there was a hurricane in your home country, so you can't possibly go back right now. And so they would just say, oh, you're extended for 6 months, you're extended for another year, you're extended for 2 years. And that is no way for us to have people living in our country. It is not right that people live under the fear of being deported. And in fact, we know that earlier this year, Trump said, oh, I'm ending TPS for, all of these 6 countries. And that actually later was pulled back. But, it's just not the right way to live. And similarly with Daca. Daca is just so inadequate. And I don't want to, I mean, I've had many students, and I know many people who've benefited from Daca, but having 2 years where you're legally allowed to work and be in the country, and knowing that you might not have that extended after 2 years because, maybe you're gonna, have some minor infraction that anyone else would not be punished for, right? Or you're going to have an administration come in and change that. Those are not reasonable approaches to the situation. So I guess I would answer the question by saying that I'm more adamant about what we should not do than maybe how we focus on what we should do. Although I would say that anything we should do should be a collective solution, like the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was, not a individualized solution. And we've done that before. We did it with Vietnamese refugees. We did it with Nicaragua. We did it with Cuba. And we did it with the Soviet Union. Well, what did those things have in common? Well, they were all people fleeing communist regimes. And so it suited us to have that refugee policy when it helped our geopolitical situation. But we need to do what's right, and we need to really repair what we have done in the region. And I think you're right, there's so much that we've done that we can't really easily fix it. So this is like a small thing, but it's something that we can do in the here and now, and it would mean a great deal for people to have the kinds of benefits that Cuban Americans had when they came to this country. For example, the right to naturalize after being here for a year, health and welfare benefits, and housing benefits, and English classes. You know, those kinds of benefits are part of why Cuban Americans are so well off in the United States today. And the fact that they came with significant human capital as well, at least the first generation of them did. But you know, we're woefully underestimating our own role in producing the crisis of migrants today. And we're, since we're unwilling to contribute to really the kind of broad-based kind of economic development plan in those countries, we're not going to have the political will for that. This is something that I think we do have the political will for. Or we could conceivably have the political will for, in terms of what President-elect Biden is saying right now. There is the political will for that. What that means in terms of how the Senate shapes out is, you know, is going to be, we're not going to know for a while. And if the Republicans do maintain control, probably we're not going to have that. But I still think there are Republicans who are willing to support humane immigration policy. And that just hasn't been a priority. It wasn't a priority. It wasn't a priority, frankly, under the two Obama administrations. And it certainly has been really the opposite of a priority under Trump.
Thank you so much.
So we only have 21 minutes and there are quite a few hands. So I'm just going to ask our the folks with questions to try to keep the questions concise. I would love to get everyone in, but Monica, you are up and then I'll keep us moving through the queue.
Thank you, Professor Feingold. And I think that Dr. Gomez, thank you for your work as well. I'm here from Arizona, so thank you for the shout out to Lucha as well. But in thinking of how our group is Latinos and Latinas are perceived, I was thinking, and you answered some of the question, when we think of civil rights, we think of it written towards Blacks and African Americans, right? And so we create erasure by way of not including Latinos in that Black-white paradigm. And one of the things that I think that it is so prevalent right now is that erasure, right, of when we think of COVID, police brutality, incarceration, the Latino history is written out and the experiences. So I was thinking in terms of policy, what do you think is needed to shift that Black-white paradigm to include what we might perceive as others?
Well, one of the really, and I'll try, Jonathan, to be shorter with my answers too, even though I could talk about this with you, Monica, for a really long time. But one of the things that would help is making the census change that was recommended, and you know, to include Latino as a racial category. Why would that matter? Well, here's one example. So, for example, when we look at police brutality and police killings of Latinos, we don't have the comparable data that we have to African Americans because different jurisdictions follow this census model, right? So they'll say, oh, whites are, you know, the whites are this category of self-identified whites, and that includes Latinos who identify as racially white on the census. But when the census actually did the testing for this new question of folding race in, they found that most of those people who identified as white on the census, when they had the combined question, they chose Latino as their racial group. And all of the other Latinos, right, the other race Latinos also went into that category. But that's just one example of how we don't have that data. And so the erasure is in part because of this mythology that Latino is an ethnicity, not a race. And my central argument in this book is that it has become a way of signaling race. And we hear this in our language when we say something like non-Hispanic white and non-Hispanic black, right? So we say, non-Hispanic white, that's real whites, right? We don't think Latinos are whites. Nobody thinks that. And yet we continue to kind of perpetuate this mythology.
Great. So Professor Sipe, Professor Volk, and then AJ, who I had as a student for a short little bit, Aniela, and KPL, and Gabrielle.
Okay, I'll go next. Thank you. Professor Gomez, this was so interesting. The questions that your chapter raised for me as a historian were all about the census, but you said that's in chapter 4, and I'm going to read that in the book. So I fall back to the frivolous question that I want to ask. It's about a different measure of visibility, and that's visibility in popular culture. I was a child a long time ago, more than 50 years ago, and one of my heroes was Zorro. But I called him Zorro. And another was the Lone Ranger. So it was a little bit of a culture clash to see the Texas Rangers and those Arizona Rangers being depicted as very, very different character from my Zorro. Lone Ranger was a Texas Ranger. It's a long creation story. Anyway, the question is, in popular culture, that was one little item that comes up in which Spanish California was depicted as an exotic place for romantic stories, but it was our story. It was a part of the United States, and it was perceived as part of our history, Spanish California, where the Zorro thing take place. And Zorro had a theme very much like the Lone Ranger. Zorro was a righter of wrongs and sort of a Robin Hood. Well, that would be an anglicization of the idea. Many characters in literature like that. If I jump to well, the television series that was in production then, I Love Lucy, that was a Cuban band leader married to a very, very, very pale redhead. If whiteness were an issue in those sort of cases, it was an effort to normalize and make comfortable about it, maybe through exoticism. Maybe through some other elements, but I just wonder if you play a popular culture series into the story, whether I'm just missing some of the aspects that would illustrate more of your themes.
Well, I mean, I think your examples are interesting ones. You know, of course, the notion of the Lone Rangers is particularly problematic, right? Given the history of violence of the Texas Rangers in terms of themselves conducting lynchings of Mexican Americans, and other times just allowing the lynchings to be conducted. And that went on through easily, well, not the lynchings, but the police brutality exercised by the Rangers, which is the state police of Texas, went on certainly through the 50s and maybe into the 60s. And, you know, who was the Lone Ranger's sidekick? Tonto, right? Incredibly derogatory. Tonto in Spanish means it's a colloquialism for stupid or uneducated or ignorant, but a very mean one, right? And you know, was Tonto in the Lone Ranger, was that an indigenous person or a Mexican Indian, right? I mean, you know, there's all kinds of ways we could slice and dice this. I do talk about popular culture because I agree with you that's incredibly important. You know, I talk some about film and some about musical production, and in particular, in terms of the contemporary flowering of Afro-Latino cultural production. It's a very exciting time in that regard. And so I think that that's an incredibly important vector here. And I do think that you know, it really varies by age, right? You and I could talk the same language, David, but then the students are like, who are you talking about? What are you talking about? So yeah, it's a really good area to explore, and there's a lot to be done.
Professor Volk.
Hi, this is a fascinating topic. I'll be reading your book myself. One group you haven't talked about much are Cuban Americans, and they played an important role in this election in Florida, much to the dismay of all my many cousins down there. I don't think Cubans would want to put themselves in the same group as Mexican Americans or Puerto Ricans or Dominicans. Where do Cubans fit into this whole thing?
I think there might be some mixed answers on that, but yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I'd love to talk about Florida and what's going on. So the first thing that I want to say though is that Cuban Americans are 4% of Latinos in the United States, and Cuban Americans are also racially diverse, right? The first generation of Cuban Americans were largely Spanish identified, but even they were mestizos in many cases. And then of course, after the Mariel boat lift, then there were many Afro-Cubans who came in. And so there's quite a mix there in terms of phenotype. Now, here's something that I want to point out is when we look at political power in Florida, Cuban Americans are holding on, but they're going to be and already are being replaced. And what I mean by that is Cuban Americans are only 29% of Latinos in Florida. Puerto Ricans are 27% of Latinos. And even when you look at, if you go back and look at the exit polls, and I have actually some real quibbles with exit polling, but exit polls for Cuban Americans in Florida are pretty good because exit polls tend to oversample neighborhoods and voters who are likely to vote. And so that oversamples higher education, older voters. And even when you look at those exit polls in Florida, you find that about half of Cuban Americans voted for Biden-Harris, right? So that's very significant. And I think that the generations are changing, right? And so the Cuban Americans that I know who are the sons and the granddaughters of the first generation, they are not coming out with the same political viewpoints. And you look at, there's been a lot of talk about Venezuelan voters. Well, Venezuelans are about 2% of Latinos in Florida. There may be 0.00, 5% of the United States Latinos, right? And so I think that we have to put all of that into perspective. So yes, Trump is doing, better with Cuban Americans than any other Latino subgroup. But he's still, there's still, he's holding on to them, but that is going to change over time because of the age of Latinos and the generation away from Castro, right? You find just really different ideas. I had the experience of going to Cuba 2 different times. And then the second time I went with a friend of mine and a group of scholars, and my friend who was Cuban American and who was one of the Pedro Pan kids, came from Cuba when he was a child and came by himself, and then later was reunited with his family because his parents wanted to get him out. And it was such an emotional experience for him to go back to Cuba. And he said that he wouldn't have done it if his parents hadn't died. And so I think we're really going to see that legacy change over time. But at the same time, it means the Democrats still need to do a lot of work. And so it's an interesting dynamic.
AJ.
Hi, Dr. Gomez. Thank you so much for your time and your scholarship. I'm AJ and currently a 3L here Your call for reparations focuses much on immigration and amnesty, and I was curious if you could elaborate on how you see Puerto Ricans fitting into your framework for reparations.
Yes, thank you so much, AJ, and congratulations on being in your third year. You almost only one semester to go. So it's very interesting. So one of the reparations pillars that I have in the book is Puerto Rican statehood after 122 years of colonial status. But I've gotten some pushback from that from Puerto Ricanos who say, well, who are you to say statehood is the answer, right? But I recently was validated, which is that in the election that just happened, there was a high turnout in Puerto Rico, and a small majority went for statehood. The what's interesting to me is that the independence movement has virtually died off, right? It's now between statehood and Commonwealth status, and has been for a long time. But I think Puerto Ricans are in this really unique position in that they can come to the United States anytime, and they don't come as immigrants, right? They come to the US, to the mainland, and they can immediately vote and they can immediately participate. And I think that's actually going to be an interesting story when we actually look at the polling data for Florida, the exit polling data in detail and by precinct and so forth. We're going to see some interesting things. And part of the problem, though, is going to be that the recent post-Hurricane Maria Puerto Ricans who moved to Florida, which may be between 300 and 500,000 people, it's going to be, those people are probably going to be underrepresented in the exit polling. And so we're going to have to be somewhat careful about that. I think a lot of the work that needs to be done is going to be by young people who go out and do interviews and focus groups and, explore those dynamics. So, I still think that statehood would be a victory and speak against the colonial history. But I also realize that I'm not Puerto Rican, so I don't really have that, I have to be deferential to what Puerto Ricanos, Boricua will want to do.
Aniela?
Thank you so much, Dr. Gomez, for your work. It's tough to just ask one question, I have to say first. But I guess I'll ask you, you talked a little bit about sort of the differences between, or you focus on Latinos of Caribbean descent and sort of their racial identification. I'm curious about the sort of generational difference in terms of that, especially given that Latinos in general are a younger population, and how, for example, the increase in identity and Afro-Latinidad, for example, becoming something that's really pronounced in our communities, and what impact do you think that that will have in sort of these racial identifications amongst Latinos?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do talk about it in the book. And, one place I think, linking back to an earlier question where it comes out, is in terms of criminal justice or criminal injustice. And so one example that we can look to is New York City and stop and frisk, right? So stop and frisk, which was a policy started by then Mayor Giuliani and carried over by Mayor Bloomberg, was, when we look at the data, and we actually have really good data on this, partly because New York was keeping pretty good data, the NYPD was keeping pretty good data, but then once there was a lawsuit and a kind of a consent decree type situation, the judge was forcing them to collect all of this other data. So that's actually another great area of study if anyone here is looking for a dissertation topic or a law review. What the data showed is that it was actually Afro-Latinos who were the most vulnerable to police violence, not African Americans, but Afro-Latinos. And so it's really interesting data. And I think that basically the upshot of stop and frisk was that people were being harassed, in particular young African American and Latino young men. And the harassment happened especially in neighborhoods where there was just an over surveillance, right? And people being stopped for minor infractions. And in the vast majority of these cases, and again, we have solid data on this, there was no offense found, right? There was no drugs found, there was no arrest made. And it was finally found unconstitutional in, I think it was 2015. So I do think that with changes in generation and with the cultural production that's happening, that Afro-Latinos are more and more engaged and openly Afro-Latino. And I think it's a wonderful change. And I think it is, I think that will increase over time. I guess those are the things that I could say. And I don't think that a similar phenomenon is happening with indigenous Latinos. So that's interesting.
So the worst part of my job is that I have to end us. I've been told at 2 p.m. sharp, but we have two more questions, and I want to bring them both in so that we can at least all think about them. So KPL and then Gabrielle.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. So this is fabulous, Professor Gomez. I am so thrilled. And I'll just ask my question really quick. I'll skip the whole introduction. I really want to thank you for sort of pulling back the veil on white supremacy, really, as it exists in Latin America. And so my really quick question in relation to that is, in terms of your argument of Latinos as a race, have you received, I'm wondering, and I would love to continue this conversation because I don't think we're going to be able to have it here. Have you received any resistance from Latinos who themselves have benefited from the white privilege of being considered white?
And then Gabrielle, if you want to come in as well.
Okay. So I guess my was, in your opinion, why is it that most Latino demographics may not associate themselves with African ancestry? And is it a more like deeply rooted issue of like internalized discrimination, or do you think it's more so a fear of facing the scrutiny?
Thank you. Thank you for both of those questions. And I actually think that they're connected, right? So it was a good strategy, Jonathan, to have them together as our final questions.
And I'm sorry to jump in. Megan, are we able to go past 2 or do I have to? We can? Okay, great. So Laura.
Okay, and I see that we're right at 2 or 11 a.m. in California. And I will just very quickly say that I do answer both of these in the book, and so look at the book. Yes, there's resistance to this idea, but I think that resistance is coming from 2 places. It's coming from people who are more privileged, and then on the one hand, and then it's coming from people who are actually experiencing more racism. And I think that that's the piece of the 2020 election that hasn't been picked up yet, is that some of the Latinos, say in the Rio Grande Valley and in Florida and in other places, in Arizona, some of those Latinos who are voting Trump as a kind of defensiveness, as a kind of like, I really want to belong, and this is how I'm going to show that I belong. And it's because they're experiencing more racism. A lot to unpack and a lot that's controversial, I know, but I really appreciate you being here, and thank you to Professor Feingold and Professor Gonzalez-Rose for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much. I'll just ask everyone to join me in a warm round of applause. It's really a pleasure to have you with us here at the BU School of Law.
Thank you so much for being here.
And great to see everybody.